This is part 3 of our section on Shinto. We're going to talk a little bit more about history, politics, and modern Japanese society. We're going to talk about Shinto as kind of as the sort of the religion of Japan, the national religion, and what that means. We're also going to talk about its more recent history and the way it's been used by politics to support certain political actions, and we'll talk also a little bit about the way religion can impact society, but likewise, society can take religion and change it and use it as they want, as society wants to or needs to. And we're also going to end by talking about modern Shinto and Japanese society. And we're going to look at the example of the tsunami in 2011 and what Shinto and Buddhism had to offer the Japanese people as they were recovering from that disaster. So one thing that's really important to understand about Japan and thus to understand about Shinto is Japan is an island, right? It's been isolated for most of its history. And the Japanese people kind of have a history of a certain level of xenophobia. Xenophobia means fear of the foreign, fear of the alien, of things outside of your familiarity. Specifically foreigners and immigrants and things like that. Japan has been very isolated, and for a part of its history, it chose to be isolated. It chose not to interact with the outside world. It stayed very closed. And Shinto, as the original religion of Japan, came to kind of represent what was Japanese and what was pure about Japan, and it kind of came to be upheld as an example of something that was purely Japanese and not influenced by foreign powers. Okay, so the Japanese didn't have a name for Shinto. It wasn't defined until Japan encountered Buddhism in 563 CE. Right? Japan had a religion, and it didn't need to define it. It didn't need to give it a name because it was the only religion. It was the only tradition. Buddhism entered Japan via Korea in 563, approximately, and that forced the Japanese people to define Shinto. Right? Shinto literally means the way of the gods. That's how they kind of understood their religion. Buddhism grew very quickly in Japan. It became very popular. By around 1600, Japan had finally encountered the West. Okay, until that point, it had encountered Korea. It had encountered China, which was the major power of Eastern Asia for most of history. And from China, they got Confucianism and Taoism, and that was kind of considered kind of a good thing because China was the center of culture, was the center of civilization in Eastern Asia, right? So, adopting Chinese philosophies and religious practices was kind of viewed as only kind of a step up. And they were easily incorporated into Shinto and Buddhism. By 1600, though, Japan had encountered the West, and it had encountered Christianity. And Western powers were very strange to Japan. They were not trusted. Christianity began to be spread. And there's a certain point, and the year fails me, when the Japanese government began to earnestly persecute the Japanese Christians and any Christians who were in Japan. And religion became tightly controlled at that point. Buddhism was allowed, Shinto was allowed, obviously. Christianity was not. And it was greatly persecuted. And there's a certain point when Japan, which had been trying to, or had been slowly building up foreign relations with the Netherlands, England, Spain, Portugal, all of which were like the major powers at that time. They've been building up relations with them, and the powers, the shoguns, the major leaders decided that they were negatively influencing Japanese culture, and they closed their doors. And Japan did not allow a single foreigner onto Japanese soil for a couple hundred years. It was that extreme of a reaction. At this time, it's important to understand, the emperor held little political power. He was more of a figurehead. He was kind of the high priest of Japan in a lot of ways. He was certainly the emperor. He lived in the palace and things like that. But politically, he held very little power. Buddhism was allowed. Other foreign influences were not. Until 1868, when European imperialism kind of reached its height, and most of Asia by that point was being colonized, including China. China was never a formal colony, but the British Empire did greatly control the Chinese government for a while. The Chinese government had become corrupt, it had become weak, it had become kind of scattered, and the British Empire took advantage of that and kind of turned China into their puppet. In 1868, an American captain by the name of Captain Perry basically forced Japan to allow his ship to land and forced them to allow his people, his American sailors, to disembark and enter Japan, and forced them to enter trade negotiations. At this point, Japan entered a real crisis, right? If you can imagine, it had been closed, it had been kind of safe for a long time, and all of a sudden, the major power in the world, as far as you're concerned, China was the major power in the world, had just become the puppet of this alien power from the other side of the planet. And they were bringing with them their religion, they were bringing with their ideas, technology, industry. And then this other major power comes in and breaks your doors down. And Japan had a pretty strong reaction to that. It led to a civil war. At the end of the Civil War, it was decided that Japan would open its doors to the West, but they had a really strong defensive reaction to the situation. That led to the development of state Shinto. So the government that took over was called the Meiji regime. It reinstated the spiritual power of the government based upon the emperor. It gave the emperor back his authority and justified it by the story of Amaterasu, that the emperor was descended from the sun goddess. They created a flag for themselves because in the 19th century everyone started creating flags. It proved that you were like a legitimate country. I don't know why, but everyone in the 19th century had a flag. And this was the flag of the Meiji era. See, with it's similar to the Japanese flag of today, which is just a plain white background and a sun. It's got all the sun rays coming off of it. You see where they're getting that idea from? That's the typical symbolism of Amaterasu. So Shinto was made to be the state religion. There was this great emphasis put upon protecting Japanese culture. Now the Japanese did at that time start adopting industry and modern military techniques, brought over from the West, but they did so only to strengthen themselves and to protect themselves from colonization, because colonization was still a major threat, right? The Americans had forced the Japanese to open their doors, and Britain was in control of China, and so there was this fear that Japan would just become another colony. So they put a lot of effort and money and resources into their military. They put a great deal of emphasis upon the emperor being descended from Amaterasu. And in time, they kind of developed this cult to the emperor, this kind of religion to the emperor. He became the center of Shinto. Shinto became the center of everything that was Japanese. And as happens in these situations, when you have a nation that kind of develops a sense of, I guess, real pride in itself and its leadership, it tends to lend itself to creating empires. What I mean is that if you're Japanese and you believe that your emperor, the leader of your country, is descended from the sun goddess herself, it's easy to believe that you're the greatest nation. We call that nationalism. It's different than patriotism, right? Patriotism is love of your country. Nationalism is this belief that your country is superior. And with this sort of nationalistic Shinto movement, by the early 20th century, Japan was colonizing parts of Asia. They were making an empire of their own. And that in turn led to World War II, right? When Japan and America started, kind of battling for power in the Pacific Islands, and that led to Japan bombing Pearl Harbor. And that brought America into World War II. At the end of the war, Japan was horribly humiliated by having the nuclear bombs dropped on them. I mean, they were not just defeated. Japan was crushed. Their economy, their industry, their cities were just decimated. And on top of that, part of the end of World War II, part of the treaty that Japan signed, insisted that Japan's emperor, whom no one had ever encountered, he was a sacred person, and no one, got to see the emperor. Common people didn't get to see the emperor. High officials might get to meet the emperor, but common people never saw hide nor hair of him. End of World War II, the Americans and the Allies insisted that the emperor himself get on the radio in Japan and tell the Japanese people directly that he was not divine. He was not related to Amaterasu. Again, it was kind of a humiliating defeat for the Japanese. And Shinto, played into it. Shinto had been used to bolster the government. The government itself had become like the priesthood. The other thing that happened after World War II is that Japanese schools stopped teaching about Shinto. It used to be, up until that point, that in the public school system in Japan, students would be taught the story about Amaterasu and things like that, and that was all de-emphasized. In fact, in 2002, I was in Japan on a study abroad program, and we were studying religion and politics. And our assignment was to go out and to ask Japanese people what they knew about Amaterasu. And most people didn't know who she was. Most people didn't know. The people who did know didn't know about the connection between her and Imperial Japan and the emperor and all that stuff. I mean, a lot of people had kind of heard of her, but they didn't really know who she was. They knew of this image, right? But they didn't know who she was. And that's how quickly things could change. Because the point of that story, 100 years ago, only 100 years ago, Shinto held a completely different role in Japan than it does today. Completely different role. It was used to uphold the government. It was all about Japan being superior. It was all about the emperor. And today, Shinto is just this really kind of, I guess, mellow religion that people don't even identify with, right? They practice it, but they don't call themselves Shinto, right? It's something that you do, but it's not something that creates as much zeal as it did, certainly, during the Meiji era. I don't know what that means exactly about religion, about humanity, but I think it's pretty interesting. I think it's worth knowing. And Shinto is not the only example of this kind of story. You find this in most religions, where religions can offer a culture a sense of identity and a sense of who they are, and in return, the society can take that religion then and turn it and use it to justify further what they want to become, right? How much does religion influence society, and how much does society influence religion? It's kind of a chicken or the egg kind of thing. So today, Japan, of course, remains pretty indigenous. or Shinto remains pretty indigenous to Japan. It hasn't really spread. You don't really hear of Shinto converts. You can practice Shinto. Anyone can go to Japan and go to the shrines and pray, and it's fine. You won't be asked to do an initiation ceremony or become Shinto. It's just something you do or you don't do. The term Shinto, and people don't identify as Shinto. Usually when the term is used, they're referring to the priestly establishment, the institution, the shrines, and the priesthood. Though most Japanese people do have some sort of home altars, and a lot of times they incorporate Buddhist and Shinto and even Confucian ideals. Here's one here. You can see it's very similar to a lot of other shrines we've seen. Usually they're quite simple. A lot of them are even simpler than this. You can see there's a photograph of somebody's ancestor. There's a statue here. You might see a Buddhist statue, or I think that's a Buddha right there, Bodhisattva. You'll see a lot of natural items, natural materials, and things like that. That's very Shinto. Visiting shrines has kind of gained a certain tourism-y kind of feel to it in Japan. You see Japanese people at shrines having their photos taken right next to foreign tourists who are having their photos taken. Here you can see there's a torii gate in the background, and there are shops here, and there are people having their photos taken, and you can buy food and buy gifts and buy those little charms we looked at in the last lecture, that have blessings on them. And it's very individual. It's for a culture that is very homogenous and really insists that all people do things as groups, and that everyone kind of act the same way and do the same thing. It is a very kind of individual religion. Everyone does it, but it means something different to everyone. Shinto is, however, at the heart of the environmental movement in Japan, as I'm sure you can imagine, as it teaches harmony with nature. If you ever watch, Japanese anime, animation movies, or read books and things like that, environmentalism is a popular subject in Japan. And a lot of it comes back to Shinto and respecting nature and not trying to alter it, and not trying to fix it. Same thing in China. Taoism is a major force behind the environmental movement, right? Because you're not supposed to alter or try and conquer nature. You're supposed to live in harmony with it. So that's one place where Shinto still kind of has some force or some influence. One other interesting tradition that's worth mentioning is that of Omoto, which is a relatively recent sect that builds on the tradition of female shamans, which we talked about in the last lecture, right? This woman here, Deguchi now, she claimed in the 19th century to have a spirit dream, which was to say a vision, right? She had a vision of the spirit world, and after that vision, she gained the ability to commune with the spirit world, and be an intermediate for the spirit world, which is what shamans do. It still continues today. The Omoto movement is really indistinguishable from the rest of Shinto. You really can't tell the difference between Omoto and traditional Shinto. From the outside it looks the same, except they do have some extra teachings about the great source, this idea of this one source of everything in the universe or in the world. And they put a good deal of emphasis on the ability for artistic creation to purify, which was already kind of a Shinto thing. And definitely is a Buddhist thing. But the Omoto put a lot more emphasis on it. So that's one interesting little sect. But for the most part, Shinto is pretty homogeneous. It's pretty much the same throughout Japanese society. There aren't a lot of different sects like there are in Buddhism and Hinduism, things like that. So how has Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism influenced Shinto, right? So we had Hinduism, which led to Buddhism, which moved into China, which influenced Taoism and Confucianism, and then it all, and over time, all of that moved into Japan and mixed with Shinto and Japanese society. So how do we break that down? There's kind of been this historic tug of war between Shinto and Buddhism, right? Like I mentioned, different times Buddhism was seen as foreign. During the Meiji era, when in the late 19th century and during World War II, Buddhism was seen as kind of a foreign thing again, and it was kind of repressed. It was put down, as Christianity had once been. But before that, Shinto and Buddhism had, both coexisted in Japan without any trouble. Today, for the most part, Buddhism tends to cover end-of-life rituals, death and burials, because in Shinto those are considered impure times. They bring tsumi, misfortune and impurity. Buddhism brought with it certain rituals and traditions that have become very common, like mountain ascents, right? There's a tradition within Buddhism to climb mountains as a sort of pilgrimage. There's Buddhist architecture called stupas, which kind of look like mountains that you can kind of climb to the top, and that's kind of carried over into Japan. And in Shinto, the mountains are seen as very powerful spirits, and the source of a lot of powerful kami. So that kind of spread into Shinto. That kind of made sense. The Daruma dolls we talked about became part of Shinto. One interesting thing that happened was, when Buddhism entered China, there was the development of Chan Buddhism, which was kind of Buddhism plus China's ideas about actionless action, kind of the nothingness of things, of not trying to interfere with the balance of things, and the importance of scholarly pursuits of studying, and that became Chan Buddhism. And then Chan Buddhism went to Japan, and it mixed with Shinto, which was also was also interested in a lot of artistic creation, or art about nature, about what do you call it? The idea of spontaneous awareness, Kanagara. We talked about that in one of the lectures, Kanagara. So the idea of spontaneous sentiment towards nature, right? You see Zen Buddhism, this very Japanese form of Buddhism, has also puts this great emphasis on spontaneous awareness, like clearing your mind so you can spontaneously understand the wisdom of Buddha. You see where that's coming from, right? So it all kind of comes together and develops in its own way. Buddhism is fascinating that way, and we're going to see the same thing happens in Christianity. In a couple months, when we talk about Christianity, you're going to see Christianity moves across the world, and as it's moving, it develops and it interacts with different cultures, and different cultures make it its own. That's why Christianity as well has so many different sects and denominations. Anyway, that's a tangent. So Taoism, on the other hand, blended pretty easily with Shinto, right? Because Taoism isn't really that formal of a tradition. And you can see how, Taoism puts an emphasis on balance in nature. So that kind of fits with the idea of Shinto, of there being harmony in nature and not trying to conquer nature, but rather be in harmony with it. Taoism also brought to Japan certain divination techniques, the concept of yin-yang, concepts of spirit and ancestor worship, and the Li, the different rituals. So that kind of all mixed in. Confucianism is pretty interesting, right? Confucianism definitely became a major part of Japanese culture. I was reading the discussion forum on Confucianism, on whether or not Confucianism is a philosophy or a religion. It's such a fascinating debate. There's no right answer. And I saw some really good arguments. One thing to note, though, is that a lot of the argument that Confucianism is a religion kind of comes back to the veneration of Confucius himself. You know, the building of, if you build a temple to Confucius and you go to the Confucian temple and you venerate him there and you perform certain rituals, that's religion, right? It's like a religion. But if you divorce those rituals and the veneration of Confucius and just take his ideas and use those ideas, that's philosophy. It's pure philosophy. It's important to understand that those philosophical ideas seeped from China into the rest of East Asia, including Korea, Japan, Singapore, all of those Eastern Asian countries, right, adopted those philosophical precepts. And in the 19th century, Neo-Confucianism, was a major force in Japan, even though they were trying to get rid of Buddhism, which came from the same place. It came from, through China and Korea. Confucianism had entered Japan the same way through China and Korea. By that point, the ideals of Confucianism had become so much a part of Japan that you couldn't unweave them, you couldn't take them apart. And there wasn't so much of a religious cult to Confucius as there is in China and Taiwan and other places, right? There were no statues to Confucius, it was just his ideas. And a lot of the nationalism that took hold of Japan came through Neo-Confucianism, right? If you remember from last week's lecture, New Confucianism was basically a reaction to Buddhism in China, right? Buddhism was a foreign influence in China too. At a certain point, the Confucian scholars stepped forth and said, no, this is foreign, this is not Chinese. Confucianism is Chinese. That right there, that's a nationalistic sentiment, right? It puts your own nation's culture above someone else's on the basis that it's yours. So nationalism is. So Neo-Confucianism at its heart is very nationalistic, and it puts a lot of emphasis on doing what your ancestors did. If your ancestors practiced Taoism, then that's what you do. You don't do what, India's ancestors did, which was Buddhism. If that gives you an idea. So Neo-Confucianism, spread or became a major part of Japanese thought. And that led rise to, the rise of Shinto as a state religion, as a government-instituted religion over Buddhism, over anything else, which is an interesting contradiction, right? It's an interesting paradox. I think, again, I don't have an answer for it. I just think it's interesting. At the bottom here I have a quote. It says, born Shinto, married Christian, married Buddhist. This is commonly said by Japanese about themselves, about their religion. They're born Shinto because when you're born, there's a Shinto ceremony. You're a small child, you go to the temple to be purified. Married Christian because not so much when they get married they want to be Christian, but it's very fashionable to have a Christian ceremony, which isn't really a Christian ceremony, it's a Western ceremony. A Christian ceremony, what they mean is the woman wears a white dress and they walk down, some sort of aisle. It's not in church, it's not a Christian ceremony, it's just the style. It's the style of it is very fashionable right now in Japan. Although I've seen a lot of pictures of traditional Shinto weddings, they still definitely happen. But most people like to marry in Western style, the tuxedos and white dresses. Married Buddhist because, again, Buddhism covers the end-of-life rituals. So, yeah, if you're Japanese, you're born Shinto, you're married Christian, you're married Buddhist. So I included, again, here's this picture of this little home altar. It has a little Buddha here, or Bodhisattva. It has an ancestor. It has someone else here, a figure. I'm not sure who that is. That might be Bodhisattva as well. This is interesting. This is a little hokora. This is a little tiny altar, that you put out in nature. Right behind it, look, it's Kanon. It's a Bodhisattva of compassion. I told you, she's so popular that everyone loves her in Asia. She's huge. she's sometimes called the goddess of mercy, the kami of mercy, right? So she's a kami, she's a bodhisattva, she's a higher being, whatever she is, she's that which is above, right? She has the characteristic of being above this world, and that makes her kami. So yeah, little Shinto, little Buddha. And then here, again, this is a large statue outside a Buddhist temple. It's a guardian spirit, and it will be called a kami. It's a guardian kami. It's there to protect the Buddha inside. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the way Buddhism and Shinto work in Japan. I've put up a document on the lesson website, the course website. It is 2 articles that I took from the internet. I just copied and pasted them into a Word document, a Microsoft Word document. There are 2 articles there. One was written on March 17th, 2011, only 6 days after the tsunami. And the other one was written a year later. They both talk about the way Shinto and Buddhism have played a role in helping the Japanese people get past that first difficult year after the tsunami. If you've forgotten, March 11th, 2011, there was a huge earthquake in Japan. It was an 8.9. That in and of itself caused widespread destruction. But after that, the earthquake itself caused a huge tsunami, one of the worst in modern history. You can see here. It's just a wall of water that just decimated parts of Japan. And there was a lot of loss of life, and the nuclear, you may know, their nuclear reactors were badly damaged, and as a result, there's still a lot of nuclear radiation leaking into the ocean and leaking into the surrounding communities where they were. So these 2 articles do a good job of showing how religion played a role in the aftermath. So there are a couple themes I want you to pay attention to as you're reading them, because this is the subject of today's discussion. I want you to pay attention to the way Buddhism and Shinto in modern Japan both deal with the idea of moving forward. Right? Not asking why it happened, but rather how we move forward, especially with helping in terms of putting ancestors' spirits at rest, right? So many people were washed to sea, and they didn't have remains to bury. They had lost loved ones, but they didn't have remains. How do you honor them? Pay attention in both articles to certain Asian ideals, I've called them. These are ideals, virtues throughout East Asia. They talk about balance, they talk about ancestors and filial piety, purity, self-sacrifice. Think about where do these ideas come from? Are they Shinto? Are they Taoist? Are they Confucian? Are they Buddhist? Some of them, are they both in some ways? I mean, balance kind of fits into all 4, right? So think about how all of these different traditions have come together in 21st century Japan, and how they work together, these different traditions. And self-sacrifice in particular. Now, I read, that's interesting to mention, that after the tsunami, after they realized that the nuclear power plants were leaking radiation, there was a question about, how they were going to clean it up. And there were a number of retirees of elderly people, who volunteered to help clean up the radiation spills on the basis that they were already at the ends of their lives. And so if they were hurt or killed by the radiation, that would be better than it hurting younger people who still were raising families. A strong sense of self-sacrifice there, right? A strong sense of, you could say it's Buddhist, you could say that it's Confucian, in the sense that these elderly people are looking for their place in the pyramid scheme, and they need to take care of the people below them as much as, the people below them need to take care of them. There's a lot going on there. It's not in these two articles, but I wanted to mention it. And again, just to think about how Buddhism and Shinto have each their own proper places in life, and how just the way life and death have their own proper places in the world too. Read the articles, they're pretty interesting. And then, this corner here, this is a Shinto memorial service, right? Shinto don't have death rituals, but they do deal with memorial services, like after the fact, after the period of death and burial has passed. That's when Shinto takes over, and that's what the second article is about. The second article is about a year later, a year after the tsunami, when Shinto, starts, when Shinto shrines held major rituals to memorialize the people who were lost. The first article, they talk about how it's the Buddhist priests who help deal with death more immediately. In any event, a question for discussion is, read the two articles, and how do you see Buddhism and Shinto each helping in the aftermath of the 2011 tsunami? Don't forget that there's a quiz on Friday, and it will be due Monday at noon. I will have the readings for next week posted before too long. There won't be many reads. It's going to be pretty short. It's just I want to give you as much time to work on your papers next week as possible. So it's not going to be a lot of reading. Don't worry about that. There will be only 2 lectures next week. And as I mentioned in an email, let me remind you, I will accept late discussion posts on past discussions if you have not finished all the posts or the responses, which you also are responsible for. I will accept them up to next Friday, at 10:30 a.m. because by noon I need to have grades in. So please try, if you have any of that, please try and get it as quickly as possible. After next Friday, though, I will not be grading or giving points for any other discussion posts from this half of the semester. Okay. If you have any questions at all about any of this, just